morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program. Everything Will Be Okay, a conversation with Dana Perino, former White House press secretary and Fox News host, moderated by Charity Wallace of Wallace Global Impact. She is the founder and president. I also want to thank our partner, Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and Dean Pete Peterson. With that, Charity and Dana, we are looking forward to an excellent conversation. Let me turn this over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank Kim. You so much. Thanks so much, Kim. And thanks, Dana. It's so great to see you. We're so thrilled to have you today. And I just want to thank the LA World Affairs Council for hosting this great event. And I'm particularly thrilled that the event is in partnership with Pepperdine University School of Public Policy, because I sit on the board. A few months ago, the dean, Pete Peterson, emailed to ask if I was available to moderate a conversation with Dana Perino. And of course, I was thrilled to get the invite to do so, because Dana is a magnificent woman. She's an incredible role model and leader, and I'm also fortunate to call her a friend. So we're just thrilled to be here. And I thought I would introduce Dana and then start our questioning. So Dana grew up in Wyoming and Colorado and has had a very interesting and tremendous career. Many of you probably recognize Dana from her work as an anchor at Fox News. She's the co-host of The Five and co-anchor of America's Newsroom in the mornings with Bill Hemmer. And she's also an analyst for Fox election coverage and specials. She made history as the first Republican woman to serve as the White House press secretary for George W. Bush, which is where our paths first crossed. And we had the pleasure and honor of working for President and Mrs. Bush together. Dana is a 3-time New York Times bestselling author, with titles including And the Good News Is, Lessons and Advice from the Bright Side, Let Me Tell You About Jasper, which is her beloved dog who turns 9 tomorrow, and her recently released book, which we're here to talk about today, Everything Will Be Okay, Life Lessons for Young Women from a Former Young Woman. And I love the title, although how are we actually not young women anymore? But she's involved in a number of very worthy causes, including supporting organizations in Africa. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Mercy Ships. I know that you and your husband are engaged with that, and you also support other women through a number of means, including by co-founding Minute Mentor, which supports young women who are seeking advice, guidance, and mentoring. Much of the advice in this latest book stems from questions that Dana has received. So Dana, let's open it up. I'm so happy to see you, like I said, and to get to spend the next hour, talking about the best advice and lessons learned that you provide in this book. And I mentioned this to you, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. I have lots of notes and I have stuff in it, and you just really artfully weave in great examples and anecdotes into the book and include really terrific resources, which I've actually used, some podcasts and some readings that you provide, but also really practical advice, including the importance of good posture. So I'm going to keep thinking about that today. But the book is intended for young women, but I think the book actually, the advice in the book is great for people of any age, and it makes for a magnificent gift. I actually sent it to the young woman that I worked with most recently in Washington, D.C., and we're both currently in transitions. And so it's just a really terrific book for that. So let's talk actually about that. Let's start by talking about the theme of resilience and life pivots and transitions.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
It would be great for you to talk about it.
That's really, that is the crux of the book. And the reason I have the title of Life Lessons for Young Women from a Former Young Woman is I did feel like at this point in my career, I've had a lot of success. And I looked back, and if you point to any career advancement I had, it wasn't anything that I planned. Right. And some of that included some big transitions, like leaving politics to go to get married, actually, in England, leaving San Diego, California, where I used to live, so that I could come back to Washington, D.C. and work for the government again after 9/11. Another transition that was a forced transition was leaving the White House in January 20th, 2009. That's a forced transition. That's kind of not exactly all that we're talking about here, but at least at that one, we didn't have a choice. When 43 used to say, Dana, we can't stay past noon on the 20th, so you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do.
That's right.
And then I moved to New York for television, and every step along the way, I didn't plan anything. And what I found is that in all my mentoring experience, young women and men, and we can talk about why I targeted it to young women as well, but I just found that they had the same questions, they had the same worries, they have so much ambition and talent and opportunity, and they really want you to give them a plan. And so I'll tell them, for example, if they want to become the White House press secretary one day, I said, well, first you have to be a country music DJ, and then you will be on your way to be the White House press secretary. And of course they laugh, like, what do you mean? I'm like, do you think that when I was working overnights for minimum wage in Pueblo, Colorado at KCCY FM 97.9, that had any idea that I would be working for George W. Bush as a press secretary, 15 years after that? Of course not. And but that said, Charity, the other reason I wrote this is because I am a planner. Or I try to be, and I'm a worrier, or I tend to be, and I know that I worried my 20s away.
Right.
And I don't want others to do that. And the point of the book is that you don't have to do that. There are things you need to do to set yourself up for success. And I talk about all of those things, the resources that you talked about in the book. I'm like, here's how I do it, guys. Like, it's up to you. You have to decide how hard you want to work. And I can't give you an exact plan, but I can tell you that if you do the following things, because you are in the driver's seat, and this economy is about to take off, like especially right now, if you're about to graduate, or you graduated in 2020, and then of course that year was not at all what you thought it was going to be because of the pandemic, but you won't even realize how resilient you are for having gone through all of that.
Right.
And that's what's valuable to employers in the future.
That's right. And when you think about, I was thinking about the transition that happened in a lot of people's lives this last year because of COVID. I mean, more women have left the workforce, but to your point, when I was reading your book, it's really encouraging to think about the transitions that you've gone through. I have had some very similar transitions, and there is a resilience that's built up, and it's very helpful as you move not only in your career, but in your life, just to know that everything actually will be okay. And having that sense that God has a plan. Tell us a little bit about, when we think about resilience too, sometimes it's bouncing back from humiliation and embarrassment or things like that. So tell us about, you talk about a story in the book. I'd love for you to talk about right now about the Oval Office.
Okay. Oh yeah. Well, of course, like I've had many mistakes that I've made along the way, but and all of us do, and all of us are human. But what I found, especially with younger people and women in particular, they will replay that moment of how they screwed up, or the mistake they made, or how the boss yelled at them, or how they maybe just fumbled in a presentation in front of the board, and they will relive that, not just even that night, but all day. And for some reason, I do think that guys are able to bounce back a little bit easier. Like they just brush it off, like, oh well, moving on. And maybe that's not true. I'm not saying that's the case with every man, but I do think that women tend to do this a little bit more. And the example I have in the book about learning how to bounce back, because, let me back up. The reason I wrote about this is because you are going to make mistakes. What the boss wants to see is, can you take a punch? Are you able to get up off the mat? Can you brush it off? Can you say, all right, I'll never do that again. I'm sorry that happened. And I use a few examples, but the one you're talking about is something that like a hurt and an embarrassment that I nursed for years. And it had to do with me at the White House in the Oval Office. It was my third day on the job as the deputy press secretary. And I don't even think the president knew my name. I mean, maybe he did. Of course, he would say, yes, I did. But I don't know. I was really brand new. And the communications director had asked me to be willing to sit in on an interview the president was going to do with a columnist about a foreign policy matter, a very important one dealing with the Middle East and Iran. And of course, I'm still learning about all of these policies. But I said, yes, I can sit in on the interview. And Dan, the comms director, said, all right, I'll meet you in the Oval Office. I'll do the briefing. And then I'm going to leave because I have another thing to do. And you'll conduct the interview. Fine, no problem. I can do that. But I was so nervous. And you know what it's like when you go into the Oval Office for the first time. So I arrive and there's a disagreement between the comms director and the president. Because Dan says, so, Mr. President, you're getting ready to do this interview with the columnist. And he said, I'm not doing an interview. I said I would talk to him, but I didn't say I'd do an interview. And Dan said, well, talking to him is an interview. Anyway, as you can see, there was a miscommunication. And the columnist is sitting right outside. And of course, you can imagine who won the argument, and that would be the president. And he says, I'm not doing an interview with him, and therefore, she doesn't need to be here. And then he looked at me and went like this.
Oh, God.
Like, see yourself out.
Oh, gosh.
Like, fine. And I got out of the Oval Office and I walked to mine, which was about 30 steps away. And I had a tiny cubicle and I had a pocket door. So I pulled the door behind me and I called my husband, Peter. And I was very tearful and I told him what happened. And he said, well, just think, for the rest of your life, you can say, I've been kicked out of better places than this.
I love that.
And so fast forward, 5 years later, I was doing the public relations for all of President Bush's book tour. And he and I are on a plane flying to do some press event somewhere. And I was just trying to make small talk. And I said, Mr. President, do you remember when you kicked me out of the Oval Office? He said, I never kicked you out of the Oval Office. Oh, yeah, remember? And I was standing right there and I was wearing the green shirt with the blue pants. And I remember that. And then Dan said this and then you said that. And then this happened. And I remember every single detail. It's still in my mind like it was yesterday. And for some reason, biologically, we are programmed to remember all the bad. Yeah. Like all those moments that are bad. You can't remember all the compliments you got over an 8-year period, but you can remember the one time that you got kicked out of the Oval Office like it was yesterday. And then the president said, are you still upset about that? And I said, yeah, a little. He said, you need to learn to get over it. Anyway, I tell that story just because it's also interesting how my husband reacted, right? He wasn't like, oh my gosh, it's so bad. He was like, oh, well, it's like no big deal. And I was so grateful for him. And, one of the pieces of advice I love in the book is that choosing to be loved is not a career limiting decision. And it certainly hasn't been for me.
It sounds like he's just been such an amazing support for you and really a great, wise advisor to you as well, which is so terrific. And I loved that piece of advice because I know there's so many young women, myself included, when I thought, I just don't know if you have so many ambitions and dreams, and sometimes it can feel like it's a choice, and it's really not.
Right.
And I love that you included that in the book. And I love too, when you talk about how Peter reacted, it is about perspective. And so let's talk a little bit about leadership actually, but we'll weave in the perspective aspect of it. So, the mission of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine is to equip and prepare public policy common sense leaders who can help solve some of the biggest problems around the world. And so as we think about leadership in our day and age, you give some really terrific examples of great leadership in your book. So I would love for you just to talk to the audience a little bit about what do you think are character traits and skills of a good leader, and what defines good leadership to you?
Oh gosh, it's a great question. I mean, I think that one of the things is, and I'm sure Pepperdine teaches this, I think it's really important if you want to be a good leader to study people who have been in leadership positions. And then you start to see the traits. Some of them will be repetitive, right? Often a great leader is somebody who can be an active listener, someone who doesn't interrupt all the time, and somebody who is well read enough but not afraid to ask the questions. Someone who is comfortable having hired the smartest person to be on their team. Even if that means that sometimes they don't look like the smartest person in the room. I really encourage people to read books on leadership. My favorite one really had been Decision Points by President Bush, and I'm no longer on the PR payroll, so I'm not just saying that. But the reason is something that I learned about leaders when I worked at the White House is that, especially in a democracy like ours, no one is ever going to agree 100% of the time with a leader, nor will 100% of the people always agree on something with a leader. But what can you do as a leader to explain your decisions, and can you get people to respect your decision-making process? And in the book Decision Points, what President Bush does, he doesn't just say, here's my memoir, I was born, blah, blah, blah. He says, okay, here are 14 decisions, consequential decisions that I made in my life and as president, that I'm gonna lay it out there for you. And I'm not going to debate anymore about the decisions. Like, this is the information I had, this is why I made the decision, this is how I came to that conclusion. And I remember getting a draft of the outline of his book, and chapter 5 was going to be about stem cells. And I thought, who is going to want to read an entire chapter about the stem cell thing? I'm like, my goodness. And then I read it and I thought, oh my gosh, now I see. And it was a way to see how a leader with a big decision like that is taking information from all different places, putting it through the personal policy filter, like whatever your principles are, seeing what your responsibilities are, and then making the best possible decision and executing on that. So that would just be how I answer that. There's just so many great ways to learn about leaders. And the other thing that I learned is that leaders like President Bush, what I saw is that he was constantly reading about other leaders, constantly reading about Winston Churchill and all the other presidents, FDR. He would want to read about others like from the past, right? He would have an ongoing contest with Karl Rove about reading those kinds of things. For myself, I'm very encouraged about all these new different ways to learn about leaders. For example, every week in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday, there's a little feature called Personal Board of Advisors. And they'll take a CEO and talk about her approach to her job and her life. And then they'll interview 3 people that are in her sort of personal board of advisors, people who she's worked with along the way that have been mentors to her. And you can see how people are pulling the best parts of each mentor or each part of their life to become the best leader that they can be. Because there's no one size fits all approach.
No, and leaders come in all different shapes and sizes with different backgrounds and experiences. And one of the things I actually really loved that you talked about in the book, is a great example, is from actually President Bush when you talked about giving credit. And there's a say like, what really matters, the accomplishment or the credit?
Yeah. I just remember that story.
Tell the story, because it's such a good story.
This is the one about the Colombian.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So towards the end of the presidency, so this would have been, it was summertime, because again, I remember what I was wearing, and it was warm, and I was just in the Oval Office talking to him about, I can't even remember what it was, but something that was going on the next day. So we're just kind of shooting the breeze. I'm getting ready to leave. And his secretary popped her head in and she said, Mr. President, the CIA director's on the phone for you. And he's like, oh, okay. And he goes to pick up the phone. And I said, I'll see myself out. He's like, you can stay. Of course, I'm like so curious. I'm like, okay. So I'm staying, and I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation. I just heard President Bush saying, wonderful, good job, great. And then he said, and tell them when they're ready. I would love to see them here in the Oval Office. So he hung up the phone, and of course, I was like, well, one, I wanted to know if I had to deal with it later as a press secretary. But I said, what was that all about? And he said, well, those hostages are being held by the FARC in Colombia. I said, yeah. And he goes, well, they were just rescued. It's like, oh, that's amazing. Can I tell the press and tell them what happened and what time the call came in? And I'm thinking, wow, well, now we'll get some really good press out of this. And he said, I want no credit. He said, make sure that President Uribe of Colombia, who cooperated in the operation, gets all the credit. Okay, so that wasn't just about George W. Bush being humble. There was another reason. So when you're a leader and you want to accomplish something, you always have to be, I would always think of it as, what is the goal and what is my job to work backwards and how I can help get that goal achieved. At the time, the president was trying to sign a free trade agreement with Colombia. The Democrats were very much against, and they kept saying, putting up all sorts of reasons why. There were environmental reasons, but the main reason that Speaker Pelosi at the time didn't like it is that she said that Colombia was not doing enough to help fight terrorism in the region. Well, now all these people are rescued, Uribe helped, like, let's get this going, let's cross out that objection to this deal. And we were at it, that was the time when, like, we could have used some good press in the White House at the time. But the president, he was like, he wasn't worried about getting one good article for one news cycle. He wanted the free trade agreement. And so about a few days later, I was walking, but you know where the colonnade is, and I'm walking out of my office and going down to the press briefing room, and these 5 people are coming up from the colonnade and going to come in the door, and then they're going to the Oval Office, and they're walking by, and I'm like, oh, wait, that was those guys. And I got to meet them and shake their hand, and that was really cool.
So cool. It's just a great story too, and I do think it does tell a little bit more of an insight into different kinds of leadership, and to your point, President Bush was one in which he looked at the ultimate goal. So like, it doesn't matter who gets the credit, he wanted to accomplish something greater than that. So talk to us about any advice you have for leaders in our country now about how to find common ground in our current environment. Or do you have me crack the code for us, Dana?
Yeah. Well, I have been getting a lot of questions that are, I get 2 basic questions now that I think are really hard to answer. One is about polarization in the country. The second is how to advise people to give their children the best advice possible to deal with what is now called cancel culture. I find both of these a little bit hard to answer, but I have similar answers for both. And the first one on polarization, to your point, one, I think perspective is important here. If you hear, you've never been so divided. Well, yeah, actually we have. And a civil war fought in 1861 to 65. Yeah, I mean, that would be more divided. Also, as President Bush used to tell me, 1968, when the first year he was out of college, he said it was terrible. Like, Americans were literally at each other's throats in the streets. So I know that we are very polarized now, and it's extremely frustrating. We can't seem to get anything done. And I think when we say, how can we solve this in the country? I feel like it's too big a problem to try to solve it that way. So this is what I try to do. And this book is a lot about personal responsibility and good decision making. And I want to know, like, am I being the best possible role model for my family, maybe my apartment building or my neighborhood, at my place of work, how I conduct myself, and like, am I living the way that I would want to live if I were to try to solve the polarization problem in the country?
Right.
Because I feel like, and that means online as well, like, am I doing everything I can personally? And if everybody took a little bit of that personal responsibility to do this, I think that's how it gets solved. I think another issue is that the social media aspect of making decisions based on a small number of people reacting negatively on social media about you, is those negative social media comments, and I write about this in the book too, like how to get out of that. Again, negative social media comments will live with you much longer than any compliment ever will. You have major American companies and news organizations that are making decisions based on somebody with 42 followers. It is insane. So I think the perspective is really important. One, I don't do any negative commenting on social media anyway, but I also think, just remember, 42 comments or something like that is, I'm using that example because there was a story not too long ago where a company made a decision to basically end every relationship with this one person. I'm like, this person has 42 followers. Why are they doing that and ruining somebody's life? So that would be my suggestion on polarization, which is like start at home.
That's right. And actually, that leads me into this idea of paying it forward. And you talk about kindness endorphins in your book. And I think about, President Bush often said to us, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think often about how paying it forward, giving back, being kind and compassionate, they're all themes in your book. And you talk about a trip to Africa that you took and how it really changed your life and how it got you involved in mercy ships. And so I think it'd just be great to have the discussion about why is it so important and how can we easily do this on a daily basis. And you said a little bit about it, but I would just love to kind of unpack that a little bit.
So sure. So when I was press secretary, I would be asked about the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, and I could tell you every statistic. I have a great memory, so I could just rattle it all off. And then we went to Africa as a team. Were you there with us, February of 08?
I wasn't, but I'd been there. I'd been to countries with them for PEPFAR.
So that was my first time in Africa, and it was just so, overwhelming and wonderful and horrible and terrible and amazing and like all the feelings in this one trip. And it was like finally seeing the statistics with my own eyes. And I got home and I told Peter that I really wanted to go back and I wanted to do some volunteer work because I felt like I needed to reset my heart after all of those years at the White House. There were days towards the end when I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and be like, wow. I was like the meanest person I've ever seen. I'm like, oh, that's me. Oh my gosh. So we went and volunteered at a PEPFAR site for a couple of weeks. And then we did some volunteer work first, and then we did that. Mm-hmm. And it really touched me. I remember these women at the hospice. None of us spoke any English, and I was like, well, what am I going to do here all day? Because they just were very sick. And so I was just sitting there, and somebody who said, well, you could read the Bible to them. I'm like, okay, but nobody speaks English, so I don't know. I don't know what to do here. And then one of the ladies a patient, she was asking for nail polish remover and the nail polish that they had, and they shared one bottle amongst all of them. And the nail polish was very thick, so the nurse was pouring alcohol in the bottle to thin it out. And I had this idea. I was like, I went over to the men's ward and asked Peter to take me to the store. And I went and I bought 8 manicure kits. And I came back and I held them up and I was like, who wants their nails done? And I set up like a little nail salon in the hospital room. And sure enough, Charity, everybody spoke English after that. And they would tell me their stories. And I just went home with what I call perspective with a capital P. And then I was a part of the One Campaign's Women Advisory Board. I was on the Broadcasting Board of Governors for Voice of America work, and we did a lot of maternal health and early childhood development work, because one of the things that they found through research is that men will listen to news and sports all the time. They love it. Women tend to like tune it out. But if you had programming that was about health and keeping children well, especially past their 5th birthday, which is such a critical age for young people in Africa. So I did all of this great work, and then my husband and I found out about mercy ships through President and Mrs. Bush, actually, and we've been twice, once to Congo, once to Benin. And Fox has been wonderful that when we go, Peter is an amateur photographer and videographer, and we come back and the young people here love to put together the packages and air them here on Fox repeatedly. And I've just tried to figure out a way that how can I give back through the fact that I have this opportunity to reach a lot of people all at once. Right. And thankfully I work at a place that's been very supportive of that.
Yes, and it has been, and I've loved seeing all of those amazing trips that you've done, and it does give you an incredible perspective to travel all over the world, but also even within our own neighborhoods. Like we can see, we can gain perspective, and one of the things you talk about is being a good friend. So when people have had a hard day, or they've done something that has embarrassed themselves, or, just to call and reach out on those days too. So I feel like taking that macro, which is something that hopefully all of us can do, is give back. And this group who's listening and to us today definitely can. We can do something like supporting Mercy Ship, but we can also do that within our own families and friends group and colleagues.
But, the idea of calling people on their worst day, I actually took that from President Bush as well. towards the end of the administration, I took these two reporters from AP and Reuters who had covered the president the whole time for a last interview. And at the end of it, they turned off their tape recorders, and that's old-fashioned term for your record button on your phone. And they said, how often did you see Bill Clinton? Did you guys have become friends? And he's like, yeah, I saw him quite a bit because he would come here for lunch. And they said, well, we didn't know he was here for lunch all the time. He's like, well, I didn't put out a press release. He's a friend of mine now. And he said, I'd call Bill on his worst days. And they're like, what do you mean? Well, there was a time in 2008 when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were battling for the Democratic nomination, and the fight goes to South Carolina, much like it just did recently in the 2016 Democratic primary for Joe Biden. And during 2008, there was a terrible news cycle that had somebody suggesting that Bill Clinton was a racist. And that was so hurtful to Bill Clinton. But it's also pretty lonely when you're called that. And so President Bush said, so I called him on that day. And I always took that with me. And I try to call people on their bad days too. Again, I don't want people to worry about things over and over again. Like I know what it's like. I've done it myself. So yeah, I think that's like super important. And the last point on kindness endorphins, a good friend of mine, Adam Grant, who might have actually presented here at this council, he just wrote a book called Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. In his media tour, he talked about this study that showed that if you are kind to somebody else, you get the same sort of chemical release that you do when you exercise.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, well, then why wouldn't we want to do that?
That's right.
That's like easier than running 3 miles. If you're kind, then you get the same sort of chemical release. And I mean, we should all be doing it more often.
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we open up to questions from the audience, let's talk briefly about communication. So obviously you are a gifted communicator, you're tremendous at it. We see it every day on Fox News, but what are your strategies for communicating effectively and in a compelling and respectful manner? Because I feel like this is really tricky now. On text and email, sometimes tone can be misunderstood, or even in writing or verbally. So would love to hear some of your thoughts on it.
Actually, my friend here, my producer, thought that I could have a business where I would just write people's emails for them. Because it's happened a few times. Like if you need to send a note to the boss, or if you have an uncomfortable thing you need to tell somebody, I'm like, okay, here's how to do it. Or let's say you don't want to go to the wedding that you got invited to. I'm like, okay, well, here's what I'd say. And I've always done this ever since I was a little kid. I would listen to if my parents ever got in an argument. I remember being in the back seat and thinking, if she had just not said that, and if he had waited to say it until we got home, and then nobody would be fighting, because I just want harmony and peace in my life. I do think that it's incredibly important to learn how to write very well in email communication. It used to be a lot more casual, I think, around the office with email, and I'm not saying you can't have fun, but I do think that written records it's a big deal. And communicating effectively, the way that I would think about it is, can I write this in a way that everyone will understand my point and that no one will have a follow-up question? I think that's the question.
Yeah.
And if you are not sure if the way you've written something, if it might come off bad, like take the time to ask a friend to read it over and to let you know. And always read it twice. If you're doing voice texting, there's a little story in the book of my husband. Oh my gosh, he's got a British accent. So, well, because he's British, but when he does voice texting, he either has to pretend he has an American accent so it turns out right, or when he does it, he really needs to read it before he presses send, because there's a couple of times he's had some doozies.
Good advice for us all. I know voice texting to me is almost impossible. So Jessica, I think we're ready for questions. I'm sure there's lots of questions. So we'll turn it over to you.
I'm going to start with a comment actually from one of our viewers. She said, I wanted to tell Dana thank you for being a great role model for me. She is the bright spot of my day, every day, 9 to 11 and 5. I'm disabled with chronic pain, and Dana has helped me with a positive mindset. I can be in pain or down, and Dana comes on at 9 and she gives me a boost and makes me smile. So
thank you. Thank you so much.
And this is a question from the same person. I remember in And the Good News, you spoke of the Africa trip and you got a severe migraine. Can you talk about that? And do you have any advice about health and how important it is to take care of yourself?
Well, yeah, that was actually a great example of not taking care of myself, partly because it was the time change is hard when you are working for the president and you go overseas. There's a time change, but you still have to work on Washington time as well. So there's not a lot of sleep to be had. I also wasn't eating enough and I didn't drink enough water. So I ended up with my first migraine. I never had anything like that. And I remember crawling on my hands and knees to the doctor's door in his hotel room. He would leave it unlocked or ajar. So I just knocked on the door and he helped me out there. And I think that one of the things that's important that I write about in the book is it's not just your career advice. This is about your life. And there's only one person responsible for your health, and that is you. Now, there are times when you might have a chronic illness, such as this person, where that was not your fault. That is just something that you have. But you have to figure out a way then to do the best that you possibly can to get the care that you need, and to pray for guidance. I believe in the power of prayer, but I also think about personal responsibility for those who aren't in chronic pain and you're young. Let me just tell you, get in shape now, because it will be the best investment that you make for the long term. And it gets harder as you get older. So I just think that well-being and taking care of yourself is just one of those things where you just have to invest. Don't think you can just start this in your 40s. It's harder then.
Very true. Could you describe your feelings as you watched the Capitol insurrection on January 6th?
Well, I was actually anchoring live because my show used to be from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And I believe the first breach in the Capitol was like about 1:48 p.m. So I was live on air anchoring it, and I worked on Capitol Hill for many years. And of course, when we were in the White House, we were, and I lived on Capitol Hill, and that was one of my homes, and I was absolutely distressed. And I actually haven't ever said this before in public, but I finished anchoring that hour and turned it over to Bill Hemmer at 3 o'clock, and we were working remotely at the time, and so I was in a mobile truck, and I came back into the house and I cried a little, because I was so upset for what it meant and what had happened and what was going to come next and how it was all unfolding. And it was just very, very upsetting and infuriating. So yeah, I guess that's how I felt, that I was able to anchor, but then I did have some emotion afterwards, for sure.
As a young staffer at LA City General Services, I walked into the assistant general manager's office to inform him of a significant problem. His response, "What is your solution?" Awkward pause. Any similar experience?
Well, I had a chief of staff that I worked for on Capitol Hill who told me always when I was going to bring something to her or to the congressman to have either a proposal for a solution or to be able to demonstrate that you are working on one. So I really learned that early on, and I learned that lesson, and it's a great one for him to have asked this young person, because you'll never do it again, right? You'll always be thinking about that. One of the reasons I called my first book, And the Good News is that when I would go in to talk about a problem, or it's usually because there's a bad story coming. And so what I would say is, so this bad story is coming, but the good news is, here's another thing I'm working on, or 3 ways we tried to get it, or I had Condoleezza Rice get on the phone with a reporter and that should make it better, something like that. And the good news is, we'll make sure that your boss wants to see you again.
About leadership, do you think leaders have mostly natural abilities, or it can all be taught? What is the role of education? My own thoughts are that in the current school system, the hierarchy between leaders and followers is reinforced. So how do we teach children they can all become leaders?
Well, I do think that some people have just innate characteristics for leadership, and charisma is something that some people just really have. For example, I think President Bush has this, but I would also remember when President Obama walked in a room, it was like, you could feel it, right? There's something there in terms of charisma. And then other people can have that, but they might not choose to actually want to run for office or be in a position of leadership. And I also think that absolutely you can learn about it. That's why I recommend reading about leaders, because that is where you can like glean a little bit of things, glean a little bit from each of them. There's one, for example, that I read recently where somebody said that they'd called up this mentor they'd had for a long time and said they were so excited because this great new opportunity that had come their way. And the mentor said, well, that's wonderful, but I'm not going to congratulate you until you tell me what you gave up in order to be able to do this. And that really hit me, because right when the book got printed, my whole schedule changed. And so now I'm working 9 to 11 a.m. and the 5, and I'm struggling with the schedule. And I thought, oh, you have to give something up. So I'm still working on that. But I'm still learning about leadership. And look, I saw President Bush 2 weeks ago. He was still learning about leadership. So we all can learn. And I don't know really how to address the issue of the education system. I admire parents today. They're dealing with a lot, especially if they're dealing with Zoom school. Hopefully that won't last too much longer.
This questioner says, hi, Dana, what is your perspective on cancel culture, and is Gutfeld right?
Gutfeld's never right. Oh, is Gutfeld right? Yeah, I think that Greg's thoughts on cancel culture are very good. One of the things he talks about is sharing the risk, that you should protect other people. I have this idea that we should have like a moratorium or like a day where, let's just set a date. Let's say it's as of April 15th, 2021, we are no longer going to cancel anybody for something they said in the past. And like almost like declaring bankruptcy. I'm like, okay, and then there's like day 0. Actually, that's a bad historical reference, but there from April 16th on, everybody should be better behaved, but we're not going to cancel people for things.
All right, this questioner says, how do you separate your feelings and emotions from difficult decisions, especially when you worked in the White House? Thank you.
Oh boy, that's really hard. It's interesting. There was one time I read this article in the Sunday New York Times in I think probably 07 or 08. And it was very distressing about how albinos in Africa were being targeted and tortured and murdered in certain regions based on some witch doctor craziness, basically evil. And I was so upset about this. And the next day there was a Situation Room meeting about something else. And I remember asking the CIA director if I could walk with him afterwards. And as we were walking, I said, did you see this article in the New York Times? And I'm very concerned about it. And I have this idea. And I gave him my idea for what I thought Intel could do. I mean, I'm sure he was like, thanks, lady. But actually, I remember he said, it's not a bad idea. And that's not a direct answer to your question, but when you are in a position of leadership or to make a difference, raise your hand. If you have access to somebody who could maybe help, take that opportunity. The other thing is like dealing with emotions. It's one thing also at the White House podium, but even here, I actually had a situation where I cried on air for the first time earlier this, let's say, I guess it was in February. I was interviewing a woman who was a survivor of a very horrible domestic violence situation, and her husband had been given no cash bail. And instead of going to court that day, he came to the home and he killed her 10-month-old baby. Shot him in the head several times and beat her up. He thought he had killed her, but she survived. And she heard him kill her child. And here's this woman. She's so articulate and she's so put together. And right before the segment started, in my ear, the producer said, by the way, today would have been her son's 3rd birthday. And I didn't keep my emotions in check on that day. But recently, I saw somebody in New Jersey has 3 daughters, and they said, hey, my daughter was watching you on YouTube last night, and they were very impressed when you cried about the lady that had been the victim of domestic violence. And I thought they were impressed. Why? I was like, I didn't hold it together. And he said they just thought it was amazing that you would call attention to an issue like that. And so sometimes emotion is appropriate, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, it can have an effect.
Can you comment on the recent Harvard Business School study identifying the catch-22 women face in negotiating for themselves? Penalized whether assertive or conformist, whether the person on the other side of the negotiation is male or female.
I'm not familiar with this study, but I think it tracks with other studies that have been put together like that. I recommend in the book reading The Most Powerful Woman in the Room Is You. This is a book by Lydia Finette. She is an auctioneer at Christie's. This book is so good. But I interviewed her in this book, Everything Will Be Okay, because I am not somebody that has a lot of good experience negotiating for myself. When one works in the government, there are pay scales, and you fit within the pay scale, and that's your salary. And there's not a lot of discussion about it. There's not a lot of negotiation. That's just the way it is. Then when I left and I went to into television, people who are on air typically, almost always, use a lawyer or an agent to handle the negotiations for them. So I was very honest in the book that I know this is a big deal and I don't have all the answers. So I was willing to seek out Lydia, who does a Q&A with me in my book, and I thought it was great. But her book also is tremendous, and I recommend it for everyone.
Thank you. Do you have any advice for young people working for companies that have a political position that is different than their own?
Well, I guess you have to decide how much is your corporation involved in politics or your organization? That would be one thing. Is it a big deal to you? Is it all day long, or is it just like once in a while? If there is something that is egregious to you and you don't want to be a part of it, you should look for something else. If it's something that doesn't really have a lot to do with you, and they're not asking you to do something that is against your principles or your ideology, then maybe you can let that go. I think that corporations, we're heading into a very strange period here. Corporations are wading in a little bit more to politics than they have in the past. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, right? I mean, they've given corporate donations for years, and that's saying something, right? That is a communication. But now it feels a little bit different. So I start the book with a story about integrity and how that is your most valuable asset, and only you can protect it. You are the person responsible for protecting your personal integrity. So you have to do that at all costs. So if you're in a situation where you can't agree and you can't abide and you can't sleep at night, then you're going to have to think about moving on.
Thank you. The RAND Corporation has in process an examination of information and a factor identified as truth decay. One element of truth decay is the intrusion of opinion into the realm of factual news. Have you seen any evidence of this in news media, and do you have a vision of how to overcome this?
Sure. I mean, even when I first was in graduate school, it was my first experience working in television, local news, and I was actually surprised myself that even I at that young age could recognize bias. And at that time, it was against the conservatives. The Republicans had won all these state houses as well as Congress in 1994. So I'm now doing media in 1995, and it was pretty clear to me, and I didn't like it. I didn't exactly know what to do about it. Not too long after that, Bernie Goldberg of CBS News wrote a book called Biased, and it was about the news media, and that sort of like broke that open. And then a curious thing happened when I was press secretary. All of a sudden, White House reporters would have a front page article in a paper like the New York Times, but it was called News Analysis. And news analysis was their opinion about the news. And look, that's fine. I guess they were labeling it correctly, but then the next day they'd be in the briefing room as a White House reporter. And I remember one time asking, like, so am I talking to the White House reporter today or to the news analyst? Like, you guys got to help me out here. Maybe lines have been a little bit blurred, but I still think that, at least like, for example, 9 to 11 a.m. Is a news show, and then I provide news analysis at 5. So even I'm doing it. But I just try to be as transparent and open as possible. Like when people watch me on TV, that's like, it's what you see is what you get. Like, I don't have time to be anybody else. I'm just myself. And I think that the viewers are aware enough of where I come from. Everybody knows I was the White House press secretary for President George W. Bush. That's probably where my perspective has been in the past. But can I be very fair? You know, I interviewed the Secretary of Energy today, Mrs. Granholm. She was wonderful, and I'm pretty sure she would have thought that that was a very fair interview.
Thank you. How does Fox News navigate the relationship between being a media/information source and then supporting specific campaigns or politicians?
Yeah, I don't participate in any of that, so I don't know.
Good. All right. How do you handle criticism about being a host at Fox News or being a Republican?
I don't worry about it at all. I love what I do. We have a great show. Like The Five, for example, has been #1 in its time slot for nearly 10 years. We'll hit that 10-year mark this July. I'm not worried about the criticism anymore. And I think that also comes with a little bit of age, right? So again, back to the subtitle of the book, that life lessons from a former young woman. Criticism gets easier to take the older you get and the more success you have, because you can blow. Now, I don't blow all criticism off. I don't. I listen sometimes. Like, that's a good point. Everyone says I talk too fast. I know. I got a lot to say, but I recognize that as something I think what the questioner is getting at is a different criticism, and that would be ideological. But I feel very comfortable with where I am and how I conduct myself here.
Who are the press secretaries you respect the most? Why, and what did you learn from their model?
Well, I love the fraternity of press secretaries. That's been really great for me. I remember when I was press secretary, I hosted all the former press secretaries for a Christmas party, and it was so fun. And I have to say that, you know, there's something to admire from everybody. But one thing I would highly recommend is anybody that's interested in press secretary life, read Marlin Fitzwater's book. Marlin was the press secretary for President Reagan in the second term and for George H.W. Bush's only term. This is such a great book. It's called Call the Briefing. And it's a wonderful perspective, especially if you want to learn about what it was like to try to come out of the Cold War and the summits between Russia and the United States. It's just a wonderful, wonderful memoir. So I would put him at the top of my list.
This next questioner says, "Hi, Dana. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Did you ever disagree with the president? And if so, how did you go about approaching the situation? Phrased differently, how do you approach disagreeing with someone in higher authority than you?"
Well, yes, of course. Although we always did it very respectfully. And again, you know, the tone was set from him at the top. He wanted you to express yourself. He wanted to be surrounded by people who would, you know, challenge his thinking. I remember once actually being on Marine One, and he was asking the senior staff that was with him an opinion about something, and I was not off the reservation, but I just had a completely different point of view, and I expressed it, and no, I didn't feel nervous about it at all. I was like, this is like, you guys can do whatever you want to do, but I'm telling you, this is how this is how it's going to play, this is how Americans are going to see it. But like, whatever, I'm just here to tell you what I think. Anyway, as we were landing, the president, who had been thinking this over for a little while, he said, "She's exactly right." I was like, whoa, that's great. So I think that being at one, again, you need to be a good listener as well. You can disagree respectfully, maybe practice. I mean, if you have a hard time with that, if you think that maybe you can't deliver your messaging in a way that is not taken the wrong way by someone, or is not, if for some reason people seem to be offended by the way that you approach them, practice a little bit more. I mean, they call it work for a reason. You know, it's not going to come if you don't keep trying. And I think that there's nothing wrong with figuring out a way to maybe role play with a friend to say, if I said this, what if they say this? You know, that seems to me like it would be worth it.
Political primaries cause candidates to move toward the extremes of their parties. How can the election process avoid these extremes and move towards the middle where most Americans are?
Well, the thing is, if most Americans want people to be in the middle, then they have to vote in the primaries. I think that they're not going to move themselves, right? So we are in the situation we're in. Gerrymandering is happening as we speak. We're in the year after a census, and so that's always when this happens. The Republicans did very well in the 2020 election across the states. So they run more state legislatures than the Democrats, and they have the pen, and they're drawing maps. I mean, you might be able to get to a place where, like in Maine, for example, they're doing ranked choice voting now. And it's an experiment that I actually don't know how I really feel about it. I want to see how it goes for the next few cycles. That might be something that could actually help, to be honest. Keep an eye on that. There's another entity that's doing that. I can't remember which location it is, but definitely take a look at Maine and ranked choice voting. Aside from primaries, that might be another way to try to get people that are more centrist.
Perfect. This will be my final question, and this kind of started the whole conversation. What is your advice about posture?
Oh my gosh. And I'm sitting here like I'm in the worst, most uncomfortable chair. A couple things. So I'm only 5 feet tall, so posture is important for me because I have to look a little bit taller. It's also just so important for your health. And all of us are on our phones and we're on those computers and we're reading and we're always rounded. And it's very, very hard to ever correct that. And I'm looking at young people walking down the street or on the subway. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is going to be hard. And the chiropractor can't do this for you. This is something you have to do for yourself. But the other thing is it's really good for positioning for getting a job or a promotion or a raise. You announce yourself before you ever open your mouth as you walk into a room. And if you watch any sort of sporting events, there's a whole psychology around this for how you want to present yourself. Like, are you confident? Do you feel like you're going to get the job? Are you going to get the score? Are you going to get the goal? Like, are you? The more that you can figure out a way to have better posture, the more likely you are to have professional success. So if you're not persuaded by the physical aspect of it, the fact that you want to succeed in life, that's why you should try to work on your posture now. I do something for my posture at least once a day, every single day, usually twice.
Well, thank you both so much, Dana. Thank you for this conversation. Charity, Charity, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
Sure. I'm just going to wrap it up and thank Dana so much for coming. I mean, what a fun, interesting conversation. I want to thank the LA World Affairs Council and partnering with SPP from Pepperdine, the School of Public Policy. And thanks, Dana, for writing this book. It's like I said, I took notes. I've actually been doing some of the exercises myself, and I've been able to pass along some of your really great advice and guidance to others. So just so fun to see you and really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Well, I look forward to returning this favor, Charity, when you write your book. I know you've got one in you. And I thank you all for having me. You do. You have one. You can call me. I'll give you a publisher.
Okay, great. Thanks. Everyone go out and buy the book. It's really tremendous. I hope everyone does. So Kim, we'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
This was such a fun conversation. Can't wait to buy your book. I know that it's available at Chevalier's bookstore, which is the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. So we're going to go get that book today. Thank you so much. This was true.
Thanks, Charity. Thank you all. Thanks so much.